Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We invite you to join us on a journey into the quiet, cloistered worlds where faith is meant to be a shield, and sanctuaries are meant to offer peace. But within the hallowed halls of churches, monasteries, and convents, the very same human frailties that exist outside their walls can fester in the shadows. When the sacred vows of piety and trust are broken, the ensuing crimes carry a uniquely chilling resonance. They are not merely acts of violence, but profound betrayals of the spirit. Tonight, we explore the stories of those who wore the cloth, yet harbored forbidden desires that led to the most unspeakable of sins. Case 1. The murder of Sister Margaret and Paul. The date was April 5, 1980. It was Holy Saturday, the day of quiet anticipation that hangs between the sorrow of Good Friday and the jubilation of Easter Sunday. In Toledo, Ohio, the sprawling campus of Mercy Hospital was steeped in this unique stillness. The usual hum of activity was subdued, a respectful hush falling over the corridors. At the heart of this campus was the hospital chapel, a place of solace for patients, their families, and the staff who worked tirelessly within these walls. It was here that Sister Margaret and Paul, a woman of 71, served as the sacristan caretaker of this sacred space. Sister Margaret was a member of the Sisters of Mercy, a woman known for her stern demeanor and meticulous nature. To some, she was perceived as rigid, a stickler for rules who guarded the chapel and its precious contents with an unyielding grip. To others, she was simply a woman of deep, unwavering faith, who believed that order and reverence were the highest forms of worship. Her life was one of routine, prayer, and service, a path she had walked for decades. The sacristy, the small room where the vestments, sacred vessels, and altar linens were stored, was her domain. She knew the place of every chalice, every paten, every candle. On this Holy Saturday, she was preparing the chapel for Easter Mass, the most significant celebration in the Christian calendar. It was a task she would never complete. As the afternoon light began to fade, a sense of unease settled over those who noticed her absence. It was uncharacteristic for Sister Margaret to deviate from her schedule. A maintenance worker, tasked with checking on the chapel, was the first to make the discovery. He pushed open the door to the sacristy and was met with a scene of such profound violation that it would forever stain the sanctity of the space. Sister Margaret and Paul lay on the floor, her body covered by a pristine white altar cloth, as if someone had attempted a final, futile act of modesty or concealment. When the cloth was lifted by the first responding officers, the true horror was revealed. She had been brutally murdered. Her chest was a canvas of savage violence, punctured by dozens of stab wounds. An autopsy would later confirm she had been stabbed 31 times, a frenzy of rage directed at her heart. More chillingly, the wounds appeared to be clustered in a specific pattern, one that some investigators would later interpret as a crude, inverted cross. She had been choked with such force that the bones in her neck were broken. Her final moments must have been a terrifying struggle against an assailant whose fury was absolute. The initial investigation, led by the Toledo Police Department, immediately focused on the hospital community. In a place as self-contained as a hospital, especially one run by a religious order, the circle of potential suspects felt small. Detectives interviewed staff, other nuns, and priests. They were looking for anyone with a motive, anyone who had a conflict with the notoriously strict Sister Margaret and very quickly, one name rose to the surface: Father Gerald Robinson. Father Robinson was the hospital's chaplain. He was a prominent, respected figure within the Toledo Catholic Diocese. He was the one who administered last rites, who offered comfort to the grieving, who led the masses in the very chapel that Sister Margaret cared for. He and the nun had a known history of professional friction. Their personalities were a study in contrasts. Where she was exacting and controlling over her sacristy, he was seen as more liberal, at times clashing with her over administrative details, the scheduling of services, and the use of the chapel's resources. Some described it as a quiet power struggle, a battle of wills fought in the hushed tones of a holy place. When questioned, Father Robinson presented a calm, cooperative demeanor. He told detectives that he had been in his office for much of the day. He claimed to have seen Sister Margaret an earlier, but denied any involvement in her death. He had an alibi, though it was not airtight. The key piece of physical evidence found at the scene was a uniquely shaped letter opener, a small sword-like object given to him as a gift, which he kept on his desk. He admitted it was his, but claimed he had no idea how it could have been used in the murder. He suggested that perhaps the killer had taken it from his office, used it, and then left it at the scene to frame him. The investigation was fraught with difficulties. The crime scene, located in the heart of a Catholic hospital, was not treated with the forensic rigor that would be standard today. The influence of the church was a palpable, unspoken presence. The idea that a priest, a man of God, could commit such a heinous act was, to many, simply unthinkable. It was a violation of a fundamental trust that held the community together. With no confession, no eyewitnesses, and forensic science that was, by modern standards, in its infancy, the investigation stalled. The letter opener, the suspected murder weapon, was examined, but the techniques of the time could not definitively link it to the wounds on Sister Margaret N's body. The case grew cold. For 24 years, the murder of Sister Margaret and Paul remained a dark, unanswered question hanging over Toledo, a ghost story whispered in the corridors of Mercy Hospital. Justice, it seemed, had been buried with her. But justice has a long memory. In the early 2000s, a new generation of investigators and prosecutors began to re-examine the city's cold cases. The file on Sister Margaret and Paul, thick with old reports and faded photographs, was pulled from the archives. And as they looked at the case with fresh eyes, a new and deeply disturbing context began to emerge. During the intervening decades, the Catholic Church had been rocked by a global scandal of clerical abuse. Horrifying stories, once suppressed, were now coming to light. A woman came forward to authorities with a story that was almost too bizarre to be believed. This new information was the catalyst the cold case unit needed. They reopened the investigation with renewed vigor in 2004. They had tools at their disposal that the original detectives could only have dreamed of. They sent the evidence, including the clothes Sister Margaret N was wearing and the infamous letter opener, to the state's crime lab for advanced forensic analysis. The breakthrough came from a field known as shape analysis. A forensic expert meticulously compared the shape of Father Robinson's letter opener to the patterns of the stab wounds preserved in Sister Margaret N's corset, the stiff undergarment she wore beneath her habit. The weave of the fabric had held the precise imprint of the blade that had pierced it. The expert concluded that the unique, sword-like shape of the letter opener was a perfect match for the wounds. It was the smoking gun that had been sitting in an evidence box for over 2 decades. The science had finally caught up to the crime. Armed with this powerful new evidence and the disturbing background testimony, the state of Ohio felt it finally had a case. In 2005, 25 years after the murder, Father Gerald Robinson, now a frail-looking man in his late 60s, was arrested and charged with the murder of Sister Margaret and Paul. The trial, which began in 2006, captivated the nation. It was a clash of two powerful institutions, the state and the church. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. They presented the story of the professional conflict between the priest and the nun, portraying it as a motive. They argued that on that holy Saturday, their long-simmering feud had erupted into violence. They suggested that Father Robinson, enraged by Sister Margaret N's control over his chapel, finally snapped. The core of their argument, however, was the forensic evidence. The shape analysis was presented to the jury as incontrovertible proof. They showed photos of the corset, the overlay of the letter opener's shape, demonstrating the perfect match. The defense fought back, arguing that the investigation was a witch hunt, fueled by the anti-Catholic sentiment of the abuse scandals. They attacked the credibility of the woman who claimed to have been part of satanic rituals, painting her as unreliable and mentally unstable. They argued that the original 1980 investigation was so badly botched that any evidence from it was tainted. They insisted that the letter opener could have been taken and used by anyone, and that the shape analysis was junk science, an unproven technique. They portrayed Father Robinson as a gentle, elderly priest, a scapegoat for a crime he did not commit. Throughout the trial, Father Robinson remained impassive, a quiet, inscrutable figure at the defense table. His calm demeanor could be interpreted either as the serenity of an innocent man or the cold composure of a calculating killer. The jury was left to decide. They deliberated for just 6 hours. The verdict came back, guilty. Father Gerald Robinson was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He was the first, and to this day, the only Catholic priest in the United States to be convicted of murdering a nun. He maintained his innocence until the very end. He died in prison in 2014, taking the absolute truth of what happened in that sacristy on Holy Saturday, 1980, to his grave. The story of Sister Margaret and Paul is more than a simple murder mystery. It is a chilling examination of how the sacred can be corrupted from within. It speaks to the dangerous deference that institutions can command, a deference that, in this case, may have allowed a killer to walk free for more than 2 decades. Sister Margaret was known for her rigidity, for her unwavering defense of her small sacred domain. In the end, it was perhaps this very devotion that put her in the path of a darkness masquerading as piety. Her death serves as a solemn reminder that evil does not respect consecrated ground, and that the most profound betrayals are those committed by the very people in whom we place our ultimate trust. The silence of the sacristy was broken not only by her struggle, but by the shattering of faith itself. Case 2. The John Geoghegan Catholic Church Scandal. If the murder of Sister Margaret and Paul was a story of a singular, horrifying betrayal contained within the walls of a chapel, our next case examines a betrayal of a different magnitude entirely. It is not about a single act of violence, but a creeping, systemic plague that was allowed to fester for decades. It is a story about one man's depravity, but more profoundly, it is about the monumental failure of an institution that chose to protect its own reputation over the innocence of its most vulnerable flock. This is the story of Father John Geoghegan, and the scandal that would bring the Archdiocese of Boston, one of the most powerful Catholic institutions in the world, to its knees. John Geoghegan was, by many accounts, a charismatic and well-liked priest. Ordained in 1962, he was seen as a man of the people, affable, friendly, with a talent for connecting with children. In the working-class parishes of the Boston area where he served, he was a familiar and trusted figure. He organized youth activities, coached sports teams, and was known for his playful demeanor, often handing out candy or small gifts. He was the kind of priest parents felt safe leaving their children with. This carefully constructed image was his most effective weapon, a holy camouflage for the predator lurking beneath the Roman collar. The darkness began to surface long before it ever reached the public eye. The first formal complaint against Geoghegan was filed in 1984. A family from his parish at St. James in Groton reported that he had molested their son. The response from the Archdiocese of Boston, under the leadership of Cardinal Umberto Medeiros at the time, was not to remove Geoghegan from ministry or report him to the police. Instead, they enacted a strategy that would become their chillingly effective standard operating procedure for decades to come. Geoghegan was quietly sent away for treatment at a facility in New Mexico. After a few months, he was deemed cured and returned to active ministry, transferred to a new parish, St. Sebastian's in Sturbridge. This was the first turn of a vile shell game. The Archdiocese knew of his problem, a term they used in their internal documents with a clinical, detached coldness. But instead of eliminating the threat, they simply moved it. They passed the trash from one unsuspecting community to the next. For the families in Sturbridge, Father Geoghegan was a new face, a man of God with no history they were aware of. The secret of his past was locked away in the confidential files at the Chancery, the administrative heart of the Archdiocese. And in this new parish, the pattern repeated. More children were abused. More trust was shattered. When new complaints inevitably arose, the response was the same. Transfer. St. Paul's in Hingham. Another transfer. Another. And another. Over a period of 30 years, John Geoghegan was moved through at least 6 different parishes. St. Peter's in Dorchester, St. Andrew's in Mattapan, St. James in Groton, St. Sebastian's in Sturbridge, St. Paul's in Hingham, and finally, Blessed Sacrament in Saugus. With each move, the archdiocese was not only failing the new community, but also betraying the old one, whose silence they often purchased with confidential financial settlements, sealed with gag orders that legally forbade the families from ever speaking about what had happened to their children. By the 1990s, Cardinal Bernard Law was the Archbishop of Boston. A powerful and influential figure, known as a Prince of the Church, he presided over this system of concealment. The internal memos that would later come to light are damning. They show, in stark black and white, that Cardinal Law and his top aides were fully aware of Geoghegan's continuous abuse. They discussed his relapses. They weighed the financial costs of settlements against the public relations risk of exposure. In one now infamous letter, a top aide wrote to Cardinal Law about Geoghegan, stating, "It is a terrible thing to have to move a priest to a new assignment under these circumstances, but at present, we have no other choice." Their choice was to sacrifice children to protect the institution. They saw Geoghegan not as a criminal to be handed over to law enforcement, but as a liability to be managed. The well-being of the boys he preyed upon was secondary to the preservation of the Church's immaculate image. A small handful of victims and their families, aided by a tenacious lawyer named Mitchell Garabedian, had been fighting this wall of silence for years. They filed lawsuits, but the Church used its immense legal and financial power to drag out proceedings, to seal documents, and to grind the families down until they accepted a settlement and a vow of silence. For years, the story remained a collection of disparate, isolated lawsuits, the full scope of the horror hidden from public view. The connections were there, buried in sealed court files, but no one had yet put them all together. That changed in the summer of 2001. A new editor, Marty Barron, arrived at the Boston Globe newspaper. He was an outsider, not a Boston native and not Catholic. He lacked the ingrained deference to the Church that was so common in the city. He read a small column by the Globe's Eileen McNamara about Garabedian's fight to unseal documents in one of the Geoghegan lawsuits. Barron saw what others had missed, the potential for a much larger story. He tasked the paper's elite investigative unit, the Spotlight team, with digging into the case. The team composed of reporters Michael Resendiz, Matt Carroll, Sasha Pfeiffer, and their editor, Walter Robbie Robinson, began their work. It was a painstaking, frustrating process. They were met with the same wall of silence that victims had faced for years. The archdiocese refused to comment. Lawyers for the Church fought them at every turn, arguing to keep the critical documents sealed. But the Spotlight team was relentless. They camped out at courthouses, built relationships with sources, and meticulously cross-referenced parish directories with the timeline of Geoghegan's assignments. They began to interview victims, men now in their 30s and 40s who carried the deep scars of what had been done to them in their childhoods. These men's stories were harrowing and heartbreakingly similar. Geoghegan's method was insidious. He would befriend the boys, often those from broken homes or who were otherwise vulnerable. He would invite them on trips, give them special attention, and then, in the seeming safety of the rectory, the car, or a secluded spot, the abuse would occur. The boys were left feeling confused, ashamed, and terrified. He was a priest, a representative of God. To speak out against him felt like a sin in itself. Many kept the secret for decades, the trauma festering within them. The crucial turning point for the Spotlight investigation came in late 2001. A judge, Constance M. Sweeney, ruled in favor of the Boston Globe, ordering the release of documents in a civil suit against Geoghegan. When the reporters finally got their hands on those files, they found the proof they had been searching for. It was a treasure trove of internal archdiocesan correspondence. There were letters from Geoghegan himself, begging for help. There were memos between bishops and Cardinal Law, explicitly discussing Geoghegan's history of abuse and the strategic decision to transfer him anyway. The cover-up was no longer a suspicion. It was a documented fact. They had the Church's own words on its own letterhead. They could prove that Cardinal Law knew. On January 6, 2002, the Boston Globe published its first story. The headline was simple and direct. Church allowed abuse by priest for years. The impact was like a seismic shockwave. The story laid out the sordid history of John Geoghegan, his decades of abuse, and the complicity of the archdiocese in meticulous, undeniable detail. The carefully constructed wall of silence crumbled overnight. The public reaction was a mixture of horror and fury. Boston, a city that had for centuries held the Catholic Church at the center of its identity, was profoundly shaken. The Globe's phone lines and email inboxes were flooded. But it wasn't just outrage they heard. It was a torrent of new voices. Hundreds of other victims, who had suffered in silence for years, finally felt empowered to come forward. They realized they were not alone, and they began to name other priests. The Spotlight team's initial story on Geoghegan turned out to be just the tip of a monstrous iceberg. As the weeks went by, their investigation expanded. They uncovered a system of abuse that went far beyond one priest. They identified dozens, then scores of other priests in the Boston area with credible accusations against them. They revealed the existence of recovery centers like the one Geoghegan was sent to, which were essentially holding pens for abusive priests, from which they were often recycled back into parish life. They published a database of abusive priests, allowing parishioners for the first time to see the hidden history of the men leading their congregations. The scandal exploded into a global phenomenon. John Geoghegan was the catalyst, but the disease was pandemic. Similar stories began to emerge from dioceses across the United States and around the world, from Ireland to Australia, Germany to Mexico. The Boston scandal provided the playbook for both journalists and victims advocates everywhere. For John Geoghegan, the end came swiftly. Already defrocked and imprisoned on an earlier charge, he was convicted in 2002 on a charge of indecent assault and battery on a 10-year-old boy and sentenced to 9 to 10 years in a maximum security prison. He became the face of the scandal, the symbol of clerical evil. The public's rage was focused on him. But the Spotlight investigation had made it clear that Geoghegan was not an anomaly, he was a symptom of a deeply corrupt system. The pressure on Cardinal Bernard Law became immense. For months, he resisted calls for his resignation. He issued apologies, but they were seen as hollow, stage-managed performances. He continued to insist that he had acted in good faith based on the poor advice of doctors and therapists. But the documents told a different story. They told a story of a CEO managing a corporate crisis, not a shepherd protecting his flock. In December of 2002, nearly a year after the first story broke, Cardinal Law flew to Rome and resigned in disgrace. It was a stunning fall from grace for one of the most powerful men in the American Catholic Church. The financial fallout was staggering. The Archdiocese of Boston would eventually pay out tens of millions of dollars in settlements to over 500 victims of John Geoghegan and other priests. It was forced to sell off property, including the cardinal's opulent residence, to cover the costs. John Geoghegan's personal story concluded with a final, brutal act of violence. In August 2003, in the Suza-Baranowski Correctional Center, he was attacked in his cell by another inmate, a convicted murderer named Joseph Druce. Geoghegan was trapped, beaten, and strangled to death. The man who had destroyed the peace of so many died a violent, terrifying death, cornered and helpless. The Geoghegan scandal was a crime of 1,000 cuts, inflicted over 30 years on the bodies and souls of innocent children. But the greater crime, the one with even more profound implications, was the crime of the institution. It was the sin of the shepherds who, when faced with a wolf in their midst, chose to lock the sheepfold gate behind him, time and time again. The story is a testament to the corrosive power of secrecy and the immense courage required to speak truth to a power that claims to speak for God. It forced a global institution to look into the mirror and confront the monstrous reflection staring back, a legacy of broken vows and shattered faith that continues to reverberate to this day. Case 3. The Masked Man of the Monastery. From the sprawling, systemic corruption that infected an entire archdiocese, we now retreat. We journey away from the public courts and the press conferences and into a world defined by its very opposite, silence. We travel to a place where the clamor of the outside world is meant to fade into irrelevance, a sanctuary designed for quiet contemplation and a direct, unmediated relationship with God. This is the world of the Trappist monks, and our story unfolds within the serene, wooded grounds of the Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Conyers, Georgia. A Trappist monastery is a world unto itself. It operates on a rhythm that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. The day is structured by the Liturgy of the Hours, a cycle of 7 prayer services beginning long before dawn with the vigils and ending after dusk with compline. In between, there's manual labor, study, and meals taken in silence. The Great Vow of the Cistercian Order of the Strict Observance, as the Trappists are formally known, is not just one of poverty and chastity but of a profound, abiding quiet. It is a silence meant to clear the mind, to open the soul, and to draw one closer to the divine. The Monastery of the Holy Spirit, set amidst 2,300 acres of Georgian forest, was the physical embodiment of this ideal. For the men who lived there, it was a fortress of peace. But even the thickest walls cannot always keep the demons out. Sometimes the demons are already inside. In the pre-dawn hours of February 27, 1996, the monastery's sacred silence was not broken by a sound but by an act of terrible violence. The victim was Father Methodius, a 76-year-old monk who had lived within those walls for nearly half a century. Father Methodius, born Terence Weta, was the monastery's infirmarian, the caretaker of the sick and the elderly. It was a role that suited his gentle, compassionate nature. He was a beloved figure, a quiet pillar of the community, respected for his wisdom and his quiet dedication. He was asleep in his small, Spartan room in the infirmary when the door opened. A figure entered, shrouded in the darkness. It was dressed in the simple white habit of a Trappist monk, but its face was obscured by a dark ski mask. In its hand it clutched a heavy steel mallet and a golf cart handle. Without a word, the masked figure began to beat the elderly monk as he lay in his bed. The attack was savage, focused, and brutally efficient. Blow after blow rained down on Father Methodius's head and body. The sound of the impacts was absorbed by the thick stone walls of the monastery, a contained explosion of rage in a place of absolute peace. The attacker then dragged the broken man from his bed, left him for dead on the cold floor, and slipped back into the silent corridors, melting back into the community like a phantom. The discovery was made a few hours later when another monk came to check on Father Methodius. The scene was one of incomprehensible horror. The infirmarian, the healer, lay in a pool of his own blood, his skull fractured, his body battered. Miraculously, he was still breathing. The cloistered peace of the monastery was shattered. The monks called 911, and the secular world, in the form of paramedics and the Rockdale County Sheriff's Department, came crashing in. The investigation was unlike any other the sheriff's deputies had ever encountered. The crime scene was a holy place, and the potential suspects were men who had renounced the world and its violence. The monastery was a closed system. There were no signs of forced entry. The attacker knew the layout, the routines, the silence. The terrifying realization quickly dawned on everyone. The masked man was one of them. He was a monk. Sheriff Guy Kersey and his detectives were faced with the delicate task of interrogating men of God. They had to navigate a culture of deference, obedience, and insularity. The abbot, Father Anthony, pledged full cooperation, but the community was in a state of shock, grief, and a creeping, quiet paranoia. The man who had committed this atrocity was still among them. He prayed with them, ate with them, worked alongside them. Every bowed head in the chapel, every silent figure walking the grounds, was now a potential suspect. Father Methodius was rushed to a hospital in Atlanta, clinging to life. He had suffered catastrophic brain damage. If he survived, it was unlikely he would ever be able to identify his attacker. The investigation turned to the slow, methodical process of elimination. Detectives began to interview all 45 monks living at the monastery. They were looking for any hint of discord, any grudge, any crack in the serene facade of the community. Slowly, their attention began to coalesce around one man, Brother Benedict. Brother Benedict, whose secular name was David Niranen, was 35 years old. He was, in many ways, an outlier in the community. He was highly intelligent, holding degrees in philosophy and theology. But he was also known to be troubled. Before entering the monastery, he had a history of mental health issues, including a diagnosis of depression. Within the cloistered walls, his struggles had continued. Other monks described him as intense, socially awkward, and at times volatile. He had reportedly expressed feelings of persecution, a belief that he was being unfairly treated or held back by the monastery's leadership. He saw the older, more traditional monks as an obstacle to his own spiritual and intellectual ambitions. He became the prime suspect. Detectives searched his room, a small, cell-like space like all the others. And there they found the key. Hidden away were journals filled with dark, rambling prose writings that spoke of anger, frustration, and a deep-seated resentment toward the authority figures in the monastery. The trail was closing in. 2 days after the attack, investigators recovered the monastic habit and ski mask, discarded in the woods on the monastery grounds. Faced with the growing evidence, Brother Benedict was brought in for another interview. This time, under the calm, patient questioning of the detectives, the dam of his tortured psyche broke. He confessed. He described the attack in cold, detached detail. And then he explained why. The motive was what made this crime so uniquely chilling. It was not born of greed, jealousy, or lust. It was a crime of twisted symbolism. In his confession, Benedict explained that he did not see Father Methodius as a man. He saw him as a symbol. To Benedict, the gentle, elderly infirmarian represented everything he hated about the monastery. Its rigid tradition, its authority, its perceived rejection of him. Father Methodius was the embodiment of the old guard, the system that Benedict felt was suffocating him. He told detectives, "I wasn't trying to kill the man. I was trying to kill the monk, the priest." He had wanted to obliterate the symbol. In his mind, the violent act was a form of twisted exorcism, an attempt to destroy the part of the institution that he believed was destroying him. He had chosen Father Methodius not because of any personal hatred for the man himself, but because of what he represented. The ski mask was not just to hide his identity. It was to become another symbol, an anonymous agent of judgment against a system he despised. He had become, in his own mind, a righteous monster. The confession sent a final, devastating shockwave through the monastery. The attacker was not some external evil that had breached their walls, but a product of their own hermetic world. A soul they had taken in, hoping to heal, had instead become lethally infected by his own private darkness. A darkness perhaps amplified by the profound silence and isolation of the monastic life. Brother Benedict was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and burglary. He pleaded guilty but mentally ill, a plea that acknowledged his culpability but also formally recognized his severe psychological issues. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But the story does not end there. In a testament to the very faith that Brother Benedict's actions had so violently desecrated, the most remarkable part of this story is what happened to his victim. Father Methodius survived. He would never fully recover. The brain damage was permanent, leaving him severely disabled, confined to a wheelchair, and struggling with speech for the rest of his life. He was moved to another monastery with a specialized long-term care facility. Yet, in the face of his immense suffering, Father Methodius did something extraordinary. He forgave his attacker. He expressed no bitterness, only a profound sadness for the troubled soul of the young man who had tried to kill him. He lived for another 17 years, a living symbol not of the authority Benedict had tried to destroy, but of a grace and forgiveness that seemed almost superhuman. He passed away in 2013. The case of the masked man of the monastery is a deep and disturbing meditation on the nature of sanctuary. It asks a difficult question. Can a place of extreme isolation, designed to bring one closer to God, actually become a crucible for madness? For Brother Benedict, the silence of the monastery was not a comfort, but a canvas onto which he projected his own paranoia and rage. The crime was an implosion, a violent collapse of a single mind within a community dedicated to peace. It revealed that the most sacred spaces are not immune to the darkest impulses of the human heart, and that sometimes the greatest threat comes from the brother praying beside you. The secret was not buried in files or covered up by an institution, but hidden behind a mask of piety, in the tortured mind of a single man. But some secrets are not held by a single person. They are shared, buried by a community, and left to fester in the minds of the survivors, waiting for the right moment or the right person to bring them into the light. Case 4. The disappearance of Sister Kathy Sesnick. Our final story is perhaps the most haunting, for it remains a crime without a conviction, a wound that has never been allowed to heal. It is a mystery woven from whispers, repressed memories, and the suffocating power of an institution determined to bury its sins. We travel back to Baltimore, Maryland, in the turbulent fall of 1969. This is the story of a beloved teacher whose death may have been the price of knowledge, and of the students who, for half a century, have refused to let her memory be silenced. Catherine Cesnik was not what many people imagined when they thought of a nun. At 26 years old, she was vibrant, warm, and progressive. As a member of the School Sisters of Notre Dame, she taught English and drama at the recently opened Archbishop Keough High School, an all-girls Catholic school in the suburbs of Baltimore. She was adored by her students. She didn't just teach Shakespeare, she brought it to life. She was a confidant, a mentor, a safe harbor in the often stormy seas of adolescence. Her classroom was a place of laughter and encouragement. In a world of rigid religious doctrine, Sister Kathy was a breath of fresh air, and the girls trusted her implicitly. It was a trust that, for some, would become a terrifying burden. On the evening of Friday, November 7, 1969, Sister Kathy's routine life came to an abrupt halt. After leaving the school, she went to a local bank to cash a paycheck. Then, she stopped at a bakery to buy buns for herself and her roommate, Sister Helen Russell Phillips. She was last seen at a shopping center, purchasing a gift. That night, Sister Helen returned to the small garden apartment they shared in Catonsville. The apartment was empty. There was no note. The groceries Sister Kathy had bought were sitting on the passenger seat of her car, a Ford Maverick, which was found the next morning, parked awkwardly and illegally across the street from their apartment complex, caked in mud. Of Sister Kathy, there was no sign. Her disappearance sent a ripple of confusion and fear through the community. The police launched an investigation, but it was strangely inert. Leads were few and far between. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into a cold, bleak winter. The mystery of the missing nun hung over Baltimore, a question mark suspended in the frigid air. The answer, when it came, was brutal. On January 3, 1970, nearly 2 months after she vanished, a man and his son, hunting in a remote, unofficial landfill in the desolate woodlands of Lansdowne, made a gruesome discovery. Partially hidden beneath a pile of brush and debris was the frozen body of a young woman. Dental records soon confirmed the devastating truth. It was Sister Kathy Cesnik. An autopsy revealed she had not been shot or stabbed. The cause of death was a massive skull fracture, a single, powerful blow to her left temple from a blunt object. There was no evidence of sexual assault. She was still dressed in the civilian clothes she had been wearing the night she disappeared. She had been murdered, her body dumped like refuse, and left to the elements. The search was over, but a far darker mystery was just beginning. Who would want to kill this beloved young nun? And why? The official police investigation yielded very little. They questioned a few individuals, including a married priest who had written her letters, but no solid suspects emerged. The case file grew thicker with reports but thinner with hope. It soon went cold, relegated to the archives of unsolved homicides. For the Baltimore County Police and the Archdiocese of Baltimore, the story of Sister Kathy Cesnik seemed to be a tragic but isolated act of random violence. But within the walls of Archbishop Keough High School, another story was taking root. It was a story told not in official reports, but in the fearful whispers of teenage girls. It was a story about secrets, abuse, and the 2 priests who held immense power over their lives. Father A. Neil Magnus, the school's athletic director, and more menacingly, Father A. Joseph Maskell, the school's chaplain and guidance counselor. Father Maskell was a dominant figure at Keough. He was charismatic to some, terrifying to others. He was the man the girls were sent to when they had problems, the one entrusted with their spiritual and emotional guidance. It was a position of sacred trust, and he weaponized it with chilling efficiency. For years, a hidden epidemic of sexual abuse had been festering at the school, with Maskell at its center. He preyed on the vulnerable, using his authority as a priest to manipulate, groom, and assault numerous students. He created a culture of fear, convincing the girls that what was happening was their fault, that no one would believe them, and that to speak out against a man of God was the gravest sin of all. The girls knew things. They talked amongst themselves, comparing stories, trying to make sense of the horrors they were enduring in the supposed safety of Maskell's counseling office. And many of them had confided in one person, the one adult they felt they could trust completely: Sister Kathy. Decades would pass before the connection between Sister Kathy's murder and Maskell's abuse would be dragged into the light, primarily through the courageous testimony of one of his victims. A former Keough student, known for years to the public only as Jane Doe, came forward in the 1990s. Her name is Jean Weiner. Through extensive therapy, she had recovered a repressed memory of an event so traumatic it had been locked away in her subconscious for over 20 years. Her story was the key. Jean recalled that shortly after Sister Kathy disappeared, Father Maskell had driven her out to a secluded, wooded area. He had been abusing her for some time, and she was terrified of him. He led her from the car to a spot near a creek. And there, lying on the ground, was a body. It was the body of Sister Kathy Cesnik. Maskell, looming over her, delivered a chilling threat, a message that would ensure her silence for decades. "You see what happens," he said, "when you say bad things about people?" This was the motive the police had never found. Sister Kathy wasn't killed in a random mugging. According to Jean Weiner and other students who would later come forward, she was murdered because she knew about the abuse being perpetrated by Maskell and Magnus. She was compiling evidence. She was going to expose them. She had threatened to break the code of silence, and for that she had to be silenced permanently. Her murder was not a random act. It was an execution. Jean Weiner's story, when it finally emerged in the 1990s, was explosive. It recontextualized the entire case. Suddenly, the police department's inertia in 1969 looked less like incompetence and more like a potential cover-up. The Catholic Church in Baltimore was a powerful entity. Had its influence been used to steer the investigation away from its own priests? Had the crime scene been compromised? Had evidence been ignored? Weiner, along with another survivor of Maskell's abuse, Teresa Lancaster, began a relentless quest for justice. They became amateur detectives, tracking down other former students, collecting stories, and building a vast, horrifying mosaic of the abuse that had thrived at Keough. They found dozens of other women and men from nearby parishes who told similar stories of abuse at the hands of Maskell and other priests. The Archdiocese of Baltimore responded as many had before, with denials, deflections, and legal stonewalling. They acknowledged paying out settlements to some of Maskell's victims, but denied any knowledge of his involvement in Sister Kathy's murder. The case remained officially cold, but it was very much alive for the survivors. Their tireless efforts eventually drew the attention of the wider world, culminating in the 2017 Netflix documentary series, The Keepers. The series brought global attention to the case, laying out the complex web of abuse, murder, and institutional cover-up in painstaking detail. The renewed public pressure led to a significant development. In February 2017, authorities, acting on a petition from the survivors, exhumed the body of Father Maskell, who had died in 2001. They hoped to find a definitive answer. A sample of his DNA was collected and tested against a small piece of evidence recovered from the original 1970 crime scene. The entire community of survivors, and the city of Baltimore, held its breath. The result was another heartbreak. The DNA was not a match. For the authorities, it was a dead end. For the church, it was a form of vindication. But for the survivors, it was merely another obstacle. The lack of a DNA match did not exonerate Maskell. The evidence from 1970 was minuscule and may have degraded. The killer could have worn gloves. Or, as many believe, Maskell may not have been the one who physically struck the blow. He may have been the architect of the murder, but had an accomplice carry it out. The questions remained, as haunting as ever. To this day, the murder of Sister Catherine Cesnik is officially unsolved. No one has ever been charged with her death. The crime is a ghost, a half-century-old phantom that haunts the city of Baltimore. It represents the ultimate institutional betrayal, the protectors becoming the predators, and the system closing ranks to protect its own. even at the cost of justice for a murdered nun. Sister Kathy's legacy is not found in a closed case file, but in the unshakable courage of the women she taught. They are the keepers of her story, the keepers of the truth. They continue to fight, not just for justice for the teacher they loved, but for a final, resounding acknowledgement that her life and her death mattered. The stories we have shared tonight are born of darkness, set in places meant for light. From a quiet sacristy in Ohio to the corridors of power in Boston, from the profound silence of a monastery to the haunted memory of a Baltimore classroom, each is a testament to a sacred trust profoundly broken. The victims were not just individuals. They were believers. Their faith was used as a lure, their vulnerability as an opportunity, and their silence as a shield for their abusers. These tales leave us with a solemn, unsettling question. When those who claim to speak for God commit the most inhuman of acts, where do we turn for sanctuary? And who guards the guardians? Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. We hope you can find some peace in the quiet of the night. Sleep well,